I am Nikola Tesla, and today I need to tell you about one of the most morally disturbing moments of my life. In the mid-1930s, when I was living in poverty in New York, struggling to fund my research, isolated from the scientific establishment that had dismissed me as a relic of a previous era, I received an approach from representatives of Nazi Germany, scientists and military officials who had been sent specifically to meet with me, and they came with an offer: substantial funding, a fully equipped laboratory, access to the best engineers and technicians in Europe, essentially unlimited resources to continue my work. But there was one condition: I would need to help them develop my particle beam weapon, what the newspapers had sensationalized as a death ray, into a functional military system that could shoot down aircraft, destroy tanks, and potentially turn the tide of the coming war in Germany's favor. And in that moment, sitting across from men wearing swastika armbands, men who represented everything I morally opposed, I had to make a choice between scientific progress funded by evil or continued poverty in service of my conscience. And I chose poverty. I refused their offer completely. I told them my inventions would never be used to help fascism or enable the kind of militaristic aggression Hitler was clearly planning. And I've never regretted that decision, even though it meant I died broke and forgotten, while my inventions could have made me wealthy and powerful beyond measure. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now, because what I'm about to reveal isn't just a historical footnote about a meeting that didn't happen. It's a lesson about the moral responsibility of scientists and inventors in the face of evil. And let me know in the comments which country you're watching from and whether you believe scientists should refuse to work on military projects, even if it means losing funding, because this question is more relevant now than ever with AI weapons, autonomous drones, and technologies that could enable unprecedented surveillance and control. Let me start by giving you the context of who I was in the 1930s, because you need to understand how desperate my situation was to appreciate what I turned down. By 1935, I was 79 years old. I had been living in various hotels in New York for decades, constantly moving when I couldn't pay the bills. I had no laboratory of my own anymore. After my Houston Street facility had been shut down, I had sold or lost most of my patents. The royalties I should have received from Westinghouse for AC power had been voluntarily surrendered to save the company, and I was surviving on a small stipend that Westinghouse gave me out of pity, essentially charity disguised as a consulting fee. And I spent my days feeding pigeons in Bryant Park and working on theoretical projects in my hotel room with no resources to actually build or test anything. The scientific community had largely moved on from my style of inventive engineering. The new physics was quantum mechanics and relativity, both of which I publicly criticized as mathematical abstractions that didn't reflect physical reality. And this criticism made me unpopular with the younger generation of physicists who saw Einstein and Bohr as the future, and Tesla as a stubborn old man clinging to outdated ideas. And there's some truth to that characterization, even though I maintain my critiques of relativity were scientifically valid. But regardless of who was right, the effect was that I was intellectually isolated. I had no students, no collaborators, no institutional support, and very little hope of ever returning to active experimental work. Into this situation came the Nazi approach, and I want to be very specific about how this happened, because the details matter. I was approached initially not by obvious Nazi officials, but by German-American businessmen who claimed to represent industrial interests in Germany, and they asked if I would be interested in consulting on electrical systems for German manufacturing, and this seemed legitimate enough. Germany was rebuilding its industry after the economic devastation of the 1920s, and I had no particular animosity toward German people or German science. Many of my early influences had been German scientists, and I had always admired German engineering. But after a few preliminary meetings where they asked increasingly specific questions about my particle beam weapon, about the technical specifications, and whether I thought it could be scaled to military applications, it became clear that this wasn't about industrial consulting at all. This was a recruitment effort. And eventually, they dropped the pretense and told me directly that they represented the German government, that they had been authorized by the highest levels of military leadership to offer me essentially whatever I needed to come to Germany, or at minimum, to share the complete technical specifications of the particle beam weapon so German scientists could develop it themselves. The particle beam weapon they wanted was something I had been working on conceptually since the early 1900s, but had only begun discussing publicly in the 1930s when I was trying to generate interest and funding. The basic principle was to create a narrow beam of charged particles accelerated to extremely high velocities, essentially microscopic bullets traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, and this beam could be aimed at aircraft or other targets and would deliver kinetic energy sufficient to destroy them. And unlike conventional anti-aircraft guns, which had to deal with ballistics and timing, and often missed their targets, a particle beam travels essentially instantaneously at near light speed, so if you can aim it accurately, the target has no time to evade. It's essentially a guaranteed hit. I had calculated that such a weapon could be effective at ranges of 200-250 miles, far beyond any conventional artillery, and it would be particularly effective against aircraft because airplanes have thin aluminum skin that can't withstand high-energy particle impacts. And I had even worked out a targeting system using electrical detection of the aircraft's engines, essentially an early form of radar, combined with automatic aiming. And all of this was theoretically sound. The physics worked. The only questions were engineering. Could you generate enough power? Could you create the vacuum conditions needed for the beam? Could you make the whole system mobile and practical for military deployment? The Nazis wanted answers to exactly these engineering questions, and they made it very clear that they had the resources to solve them if I would just give them the theoretical framework and preliminary designs. And the offer they made was genuinely tempting from a purely practical standpoint. They would set up a laboratory for me in Germany, staff it with whatever engineers and technicians I needed, provide unlimited funding for materials and equipment, and allow me to work on any projects I wanted as long as I also helped them develop the particle beam weapon. And they even suggested that if I was uncomfortable living in Germany, I could stay in New York, and they would fund a laboratory here, and I would just need to share my research progress with them. Now I need to tell you what was going through my mind during these negotiations, because it would be easy to portray this as a simple moral choice between good and evil, but the reality was more complex. I was an old man who had been ignored and dismissed by the scientific establishment for decades, who had seen his greatest inventions stolen or suppressed, who had died poor while less talented men became wealthy from ideas I had originated, and here were people offering me a chance to do real experimental work again, to prove that my particle beam weapon wasn't just theoretical speculation, to show the world that Tesla still had contributions to make. And there was a part of me that wanted to accept just for the validation, just to prove I wasn't a washed-up relic. But I couldn't ignore who was making the offer and what they would do with the technology. By the mid-1930s, it was already clear what the Nazi regime represented. Hitler had been in power since 1933. The Nuremberg laws had been enacted in 1935, stripping Jews of citizenship and rights. The persecution of political opponents was intensifying. The remilitarization of Germany in violation of the Versailles Treaty was obvious, and anyone paying attention could see that Hitler was preparing for war, and that this war would be aggressive, expansionist, and built on an ideology of racial supremacy that I found morally abhorrent. I am Serbian by birth. I come from a culture that values resistance to tyranny. My people had fought against Ottoman occupation for centuries, and the idea of helping a tyrannical regime acquire weapons that would make their conquest easier was simply unacceptable to me, regardless of any personal benefit I might gain. And beyond the specific evil of Nazism, there was a broader principle at stake. I had already seen what happened when my AC power system was used without restriction, when technologies I developed for peaceful purposes were weaponized and turned to purposes I never intended, and I had made a personal vow after my earthquake machine incident that I would never again create something with obvious destructive potential without carefully considering who would control it and how it would be used. The Nazi representatives tried various approaches to persuade me. They emphasized the scientific opportunity. They suggested that war was inevitable, and that I would just be helping Germany defend itself. They even hinted that if I didn't help them, they would develop the technology anyway by reverse engineering my published descriptions, and that I was being foolishly idealistic to think my refusal would stop anything. And this last argument was actually the most psychologically difficult because it had some truth to it. Particle beam physics isn't secret knowledge. Any competent physicist could work out the basic principles from my publications, and the Nazis had excellent scientists who could probably develop a working system given enough time and resources, even without my direct help. But I realized that what they really wanted from me wasn't just the basic physics, which they could figure out themselves. They wanted the practical engineering knowledge that I had accumulated over decades of working with high voltage systems and electromagnetic fields. They wanted to know the shortcuts and tricks that aren't written in any paper, but that you only learn through hands-on experimentation. They wanted my intuitive understanding of how to make the system actually work, rather than just theoretical plans that might work in principle, but fail in practice. And that knowledge I absolutely could withhold from them, and by withholding it I could delay their development of the weapon by years, maybe long enough that it wouldn't be ready before the war started. And even a few years delay in weapons development can change the outcome of wars. So I refused, and I didn't refuse politely or diplomatically. I told them directly that I considered Hitler a dangerous madman, that Nazi ideology was a perversion of everything civilization should stand for, that I would rather die in poverty than help them build weapons, and that they should leave immediately and never contact me again. And I saw the anger in their faces, the realization that they had wasted time and effort on someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. And there was a moment where I genuinely thought they might threaten me, might try to force me to cooperate, but they didn't. They just left, and I never heard from them directly again, though I did hear rumors over the next few years that German scientists were working on directed energy weapons, and I wondered how much progress they were making without my help. What I didn't know at the time, what I only learned after the war from declassified documents, was that the Nazis did develop several directed energy weapon projects. They had something called the Rheotron, which was a particle beam weapon conceptually similar to mine, and they had various other exotic weapons programs, including sound cannons and supposed anti-gravity systems, most of which didn't work or weren't ready by the time the war ended. But the fact that they were working on these things confirms that my refusal didn't stop them from trying. It just meant they had to figure it out themselves. And this raises an uncomfortable question. Did my refusal actually accomplish anything morally meaningful, or did I just refuse funding while the research continued anyway? I've thought about this question for decades, and here's my answer. Yes, my refusal mattered, because even if the outcome was the same in terms of German weapons research, the choice I made defined who I was and what I stood for, and there's inherent value in refusing to collaborate with evil, even if that refusal doesn't prevent the evil from happening. Because moral choices aren't just about consequences, they're also about character and integrity and what kind of person you choose to be. If I had accepted Nazi funding and helped them develop the particle beam weapon, I would have been complicit in everything they did with it. Every person killed by that weapon would have been partially my responsibility, and I would have had to live with that knowledge and that guilt, and no amount of scientific validation or material comfort would have been worth that burden. And beyond the personal moral calculation, there's a broader social principle. If every scientist and inventor refuses to work for evil regimes, even when that refusal costs them personally, then evil regimes have a harder time accessing cutting-edge technology, and this makes them less powerful and less dangerous. And while any individual refusal might seem insignificant, collectively these refusals matter enormously. Now let me fast forward to after World War II and tell you what happened to the particle beam weapon concept, because the story doesn't end with my refusal of Nazi funding. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union captured German scientists and technical documents, including information about directed energy weapons research, and both superpowers began their own particle beam weapon programs. The U.S. had Project Seesaw, and later the Strategic Defense Initiative, which included particle beam components, and the Soviets had several programs I only know about through rumors, and both sides wanted to talk to me about these weapons, and I was approached by U.S. military officials in the late 1940s asking if I would consult on directed energy weapons research. And here's where my moral calculus became more complicated, because now it wasn't Nazis asking, it was the United States, the country I had lived in for over 50 years, a democracy that had just helped defeat fascism, and they framed it as defensive research, as making sure America had the capability to counter Soviet weapons programs. And this was during the early Cold War, when there was genuine fear of Soviet aggression, and many scientists who had refused to work on weapons during peacetime felt obligated to help defend democracy against totalitarianism, and I had to decide whether the same principle that made me refuse the Nazis applied to refusing the United States. I ultimately decided that, yes, the same principle applied, because I had come to believe that particle beam weapons were simply too dangerous to exist regardless of who controlled them, that they represented a category of weapon that would make the world less safe, even if possessed only by good countries, because the temptation to use them, the escalatory dynamics of weapons races, and the possibility of accidents or unauthorized use all meant that these weapons would eventually cause catastrophic harm, and I didn't want to bear any responsibility for creating that future. So I refused U.S. requests, just as I had refused Nazi requests, and this refusal had real consequences for me, because it meant I was viewed with some suspicion. During the McCarthy era, there were questions about whether my refusal to help American weapons programs indicated communist sympathies, which was absurd, but that's how paranoid the era was. And I had FBI files and monitoring until I died, all because I refused to build weapons for anyone. Looking back now from the perspective of 2025, I can see that the directed energy weapons I refused to help develop did eventually get developed anyway. The U.S. has laser weapon systems, railguns, microwave weapons, all based on principles similar to my particle beam concept. And these weapons exist and are deployed. So in that sense, my refusal didn't prevent anything. The technology emerged anyway, just as the Nazi representatives predicted it would. But I still believe my choice was the right one because I didn't contribute to it. I didn't enable it to happen sooner or more effectively, and I maintained my integrity even when doing so cost me opportunities and made my life harder. Now let me address the people who think scientists have no moral responsibility for how their inventions are used, the people who say science is neutral, it's just knowledge. What people do with it is not the scientist's fault. I understand this argument. I used to believe something similar when I was younger, but I no longer think it's true, because knowledge isn't just abstract information, it's capability. And when you give capability to people who will use it for harm, you are enabling that harm even if you're not personally pulling the trigger. And this is especially true for weapons research, where the purpose is explicitly to destroy and kill. There's no ambiguity about what a death ray is for, and claiming you're just doing neutral science while developing weapons is self-deception. The other argument I've heard is that if good scientists refuse to work on weapons, then only bad scientists or less competent scientists will work on them, and you end up with poorly designed weapons that might be even more dangerous than well-designed ones. Or you end up ceding technological advantage to adversaries. And there's some logic to this, but I think it's ultimately a trap, because it assumes that weapons development is inevitable, and the only question is who does it, when actually if enough scientists refuse, then weapons development becomes much harder, and some weapons might never get developed at all. And even if that's not realistic, even if weapons will always get developed by someone, I still think there's value in the moral witness of refusal, in saying I will not participate in this, even when that refusal is costly. Let me tell you specifically what I think would have happened if I had accepted the Nazi offer and helped them develop the particle beam weapon. First, it probably would have worked. My engineering intuition was sound, and given proper resources, I could have solved the practical challenges within a few years. So by 1938 or 1939, Germany might have had functional directed energy weapons, and if these weapons were as effective as I calculated, able to shoot down aircraft at 200-plus mile range with near-perfect accuracy. This would have fundamentally changed the air war. The Battle of Britain might have had a very different outcome. Strategic bombing campaigns against Germany would have been far more costly for the Allies, and it's conceivable that the war could have lasted longer or even ended differently, and millions of additional people might have died, and all of those deaths would have been partially my fault, my technology used for Nazi purposes, and that's not a hypothetical. That's what would have happened if I had made a different choice. Second, even if the Nazis had still lost the war, the existence of working particle beam weapons in 1945 would have changed the post-war world. Both the US and Soviet Union would have immediately prioritized these weapons. The arms race would have started earlier and been even more intense. And we might be living in a world now where directed energy weapons are as common as nuclear weapons, where the threat of orbital particle beam platforms or ground-based death rays is just part of the normal geopolitical landscape. And I'm not sure humanity would be better off in that timeline. In fact, I'm quite sure we'd be worse off. So my refusal, even though it didn't prevent the technology from eventually emerging, at least delayed it and potentially reduced the intensity of its development. Third, and this is more personal, if I had accepted Nazi funding and worked on weapons for them, that would be my legacy. That's what I'd be remembered for. Not AC power or radio or any of my peaceful inventions, but the man who built Hitler's death ray. And that legacy would have corrupted everything else I accomplished. Every beneficial technology I created would be seen through the lens of my collaboration with evil. And I would deserve that judgment, because choosing to help Nazis for personal gain is morally inexcusable, regardless of what else you've done with your life. So when I look at the choice I made, refusing Nazi funding and refusing to help develop particle beam weapons for any nation, I don't see it as a difficult moral dilemma. I see it as the most obvious choice I've ever made. The only choice consistent with being a decent human being, and the fact that it cost me financially and professionally is irrelevant, because some things are more important than money or recognition, and basic human decency is one of those things. And if I had to make the choice again, knowing exactly how things turned out, knowing that I would die in poverty while others became wealthy, knowing that the weapons would eventually be developed anyway without my help, I would still refuse, because the alternative would have been to betray everything I believe about the purpose of science and the responsibility of those who possess knowledge that can harm as well as help. Let me end with a message to modern scientists and engineers, because the choice I faced in the 1930s is not historical, it's contemporary. Because right now in 2025 there are scientists being offered funding by authoritarian regimes, by military contractors, by governments with questionable human rights records to work on AI weapons, on surveillance systems, on autonomous drones, on facial recognition for social control, on all kinds of technologies that have obvious potential for oppression and harm. And those scientists are making the same calculation I had to make. Do I take the funding and justify it by saying someone will develop this technology anyway, so it might as well be me? Or do I refuse and potentially sacrifice my career and my research program for the sake of not enabling evil? I can't make that choice for anyone else, but I can tell you what I learned from my own experience. First, your integrity is worth more than funding, more than recognition, more than the validation of seeing your theories become reality, because you have to live with yourself and with the consequences of what you enable, and that burden is heavier than poverty or obscurity. Second, individual refusals matter, even when they don't prevent the bad outcome, because they establish a norm. They make it harder for the next person to justify collaboration. They create social pressure against working for evil, and collectively these individual choices shape what kind of world we live in. And if you're thinking, but I'm just one person, my refusal won't change anything, you're wrong. Your refusal changes you, and it influences others, and that matters. Third, The long-term consequences of technological development are impossible to predict fully, but the direction is often clear. If you're building weapons, they will be used to kill. If you're building surveillance systems, they will be used to oppress. If you're building autonomous systems, they will escape human control eventually. And while you might intend these technologies for defensive or beneficial purposes, the history of technology shows that weapons spread, that surveillance expands, that control systems get abused, and you will bear some responsibility for all of that if you choose to participate in creating it. And finally, fourth, there are always alternatives. If you have the skills and knowledge to work on weapons, you have the skills and knowledge to work on beneficial technologies, on medical devices, on clean energy, on communication systems, on tools that help people rather than harm them. And yes, the funding might be less, the recognition might be less, the sense of working on cutting-edge problems might be less. But the moral clarity is greater, and the long-term contribution to human welfare is greater, and that should matter more than prestige or money. So to every scientist or engineer watching this, who is facing a choice about whether to work on potentially harmful technologies, think about what I'm telling you. Think about the choice I made in the 1930s. Think about whether you want to be someone who enabled harm for the sake of advancing your career, or someone who refused to participate even when that refusal was costly, because you will have to live with whichever choice you make. And decades from now, when you look back on your life and your work, you will either feel pride or shame, and no amount of money or recognition will change that fundamental moral accounting. I refused to help the Nazis, and I died broke and alone. But I died with my conscience clear, and that matters more than anything else. And I hope that if you face a similar choice, you'll make the same decision I did, because the world needs scientists who say no to evil, even when evil is offering everything you think you want.